Boundaries without anger. Welcome back, Reasonauts. As you know, my name isn't important. The message is. And remembering, every day is awesome. We just have to get through it. And before we begin, if these conversations resonate with you, subscribe and stay with us each week. Share them with someone who's navigating change they don't quite know how to explain. And if you'd like to continue the conversation, you can find us on Facebook too. Not for noise, not for attention, just a place where people learning to grow don't have to do it alone. Last week, we talked about what happens when you begin outgrowing people, how growth can change relationships, how some people are meant for a chapter, some for a volume, and a few for the entire story, and how not every ending requires an enemy. This week, we're stepping into something many people misunderstand. Boundaries. Not walls, not punishment, not control. Boundaries without anger. Now, I want you to think about someone you genuinely care about, someone you want in your life, someone whose presence has meant something to you. Don't think about how many times you've said yes, when everything inside you is asking for a no. For some reason, people often assume boundaries are hostile, cold, defensive, unkind, like they're walls, like they're punishments, like they're weapons used to keep people out. And because of that, many people avoid them entirely. They worry they'll seem selfish, difficult, unloving. They worry setting a boundary means rejecting someone, disappointing someone, hurting someone. But that's not what a boundary is, not really. A boundary is information, that's all. It simply tells people where you end and where they begin, what you're responsible for, what you're not responsible for, what you can offer, what you cannot offer, what creates connection, and what creates harm. A healthy boundary isn't an act of rejection, it's an act of clarity. The problem is, most people don't discover boundaries when life is going well. They discover them after exhaustion, after resentment, after overextending, after saying yes when they meant no, after carrying emotions that weren't theirs to carry, after solving problems that weren't theirs to solve, after becoming responsible for things they never agreed to own. And by the time they finally realize a boundary is needed, they're already depleted, already frustrated, already overwhelmed, already running on empty. That's why so many boundaries arrive carrying anger, not because boundaries are angry, because the person setting them is exhausted. They're no longer responding from clarity, they're responding from accumulated depletion. And the boundary sounds different when it arrives from that place. Instead of, I need some space, it becomes, leave me alone. Instead of, I can't carry this for you, it becomes, I'm done. Instead of information, it arrives sounding like frustration. And everyone involved associates the boundary with conflict. But the conflict wasn't created by the boundary. The conflict was created by how long the boundary went unspoken. That's an important distinction. Because healthy boundaries rarely feel dramatic. They feel clear, calm, consistent. They don't arrive at the breaking point. They arrive before it. They don't appear after resentment has already built. They prevent resentment from building in the first place. And that's what awareness eventually learns. Boundaries are not signs that love is disappearing. Often they're signs that love is trying to survive. Because without boundaries, people begin carrying things they were never designed to carry. And eventually, the weight changes them. The resentment changes them. The exhaustion changes them. But a healthy boundary says, I care about this relationship enough to be honest about what I can sustain. That's not cruelty. That's stewardship. That's respect. And perhaps one of the greatest misunderstandings about boundaries is this. People think boundaries create distance. But healthy boundaries often create the very conditions that allow connection to remain healthy over time. Because relationships don't usually break from too much honesty. They break from too much unspoken strain. And boundaries are one of the ways we finally give that strain a voice. Not through anger, not through rejection, through clarity. And clarity, when offered with care, is one of the most loving things a person can give. The feeling of remembering all the times you knew something wasn't right and kept going anyway. You felt this before. Most people have. That moment when something didn't sit right. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a quiet feeling, a subtle tension, a hesitation, a signal, a request, a favor, an expectation, a conversation, a relationship dynamic. And somewhere inside, something whispered, "This is too much. Not this time. I don't have the capacity. This doesn't feel right." But saying no felt harder than carrying the burden. So you ignored it. Maybe because you wanted to help. Maybe because you genuinely cared. Maybe because you didn't want conflict. Maybe because you didn't want to disappoint anyone. Maybe because being needed felt safer than being misunderstood. So you said yes, again and again and again. At first it doesn't seem like a problem. It's just one favor, one accommodation, one compromise, one extra effort, one more thing. And because nothing explodes immediately, you assume everything is fine. But awareness notices something long before the mind admits it. Every time you override your signal, you create a small distance between yourself and yourself. A small betrayal, not dramatic, not intentional, just a quiet decision to trust someone else's comfort more than your own truth. And the strange thing is, the other person often has no idea. They're simply responding to the answer you gave. They're not mind readers. They can't hear the no hidden underneath your yes. So they continue. The pattern continues. The expectation grows. The dynamic becomes normal. And eventually, the yes becomes resentment. Not all at once, slowly, quietly. A little frustration here, a little exhaustion there, a little irritation you can't quite explain, until one day you realize you're carrying something you never truly agreed to carry. And now the burden feels personal. Now the relationship feels heavy. Now the request feels unfair. But often the real problem started much earlier, back when awareness whispered, "This is too much," and you didn't listen. That's an uncomfortable realization, because it means the resentment isn't always caused by what others asked of us. Sometimes it's caused by how many times we abandoned our own signal, how many times we volunteered ourselves for responsibilities our nervous system was already warning us about, how many times we confused self-sacrifice with love, compliance with kindness, overextension with generosity. And awareness notices that eventually. It begins connecting the pattern. It begins realizing that boundaries are not merely about protecting yourself from other people. They're also about staying connected to your own internal truth. Because every healthy boundary starts long before the word no. It starts with listening. Listening to that quiet signal, that subtle hesitation, that internal knowing. The part of you that recognizes your limits before your exhaustion does. And maybe that's why so many people wait too long. Not because they don't know, because they knew. They just didn't trust themselves enough to honor what they already felt. And the longer we ignore those signals, the louder they eventually become. Until what started as a whisper becomes something that can no longer be ignored. The feeling of standing at the edge of a conversation you've already had 100 times in your head. You already knew, long before the words arrived. Long before the boundary was spoken, long before the conversation finally happened, you knew. Weeks ago, maybe months ago, maybe even longer. Every time the phone rang, every time the request arrived, every time the expectation appeared, something inside you sighed. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough for awareness to notice. A subtle heaviness, a quiet resistance. A feeling you kept trying to explain away. You told yourself, it's not a big deal. They need me. It's only this once. I can handle it. And maybe sometimes you could, but awareness kept noticing the pattern. Because the exhaustion wasn't coming from a single request. It was coming from accumulation, from carrying one more thing, and then one more, and then one more. Until your life slowly became organized around obligations you never consciously chose. Not because you hated them, not because you didn't care, because you were tired of carrying more, tired of always being available, tired of being the solution, tired of being the one who absorbs the pressure, tired of being the person who says yes before checking whether they even have room. And still, you kept saying yes, not out of love. That's the difficult part. Because we often call it love, we call it kindness, generosity, compassion, patience. But sometimes it's guilt. And guilt has a way of disguising itself as kindness. It wears the same clothes, uses the same language, produces the same behavior, at least at first. But there's a difference. Love chooses, guilt complies. Love gives freely, guilt gives fearfully. Love says, I want to help. Guilt says, I'll feel bad if I don't. And awareness eventually learns to hear the difference, because one leaves you connected, the other leaves you depleted, and eventually the conversation you've been avoiding becomes the conversation you have to have, not because you suddenly became brave, because the cost of avoiding it finally became greater than the discomfort of saying it. Maybe the conversation was simple, a quiet, I can't do that anymore. Maybe it was uncomfortable. Maybe your voice shook. Maybe your heart raced. Maybe you rehearsed it 20 times before making the call. Maybe you spent days worrying about how it would be received, because that's what happens when you spend a lifetime equating boundaries with disappointment. But somewhere in that moment, you finally said it, not perfectly, not dramatically, just honestly, I can't keep doing this. And then something surprising happened. The catastrophe you imagined never arrived. The sky didn't fall, the earth didn't split open, the world didn't collapse, the relationship didn't instantly disappear. Life simply kept moving. And for the first time in a long time, reality matched what awareness had already been trying to tell you. That's the strange thing about boundaries. The fear of setting them is often much larger than the boundary itself, because most of the suffering happens before the conversation, in the anticipation, in the guilt, in the stories we tell ourselves about what might happen. But once the truth is spoken, something settles, not because everything becomes easy, because everything becomes honest. And honesty has a way of creating relief, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Because what actually happened in that moment wasn't rejection. It wasn't conflict. It wasn't cruelty. It was something much simpler. Reality finally caught up to what your awareness had known for a very long time. The feeling of standing in a house you spent years maintaining and suddenly realizing there's no room left for you inside it. Without boundaries, everything becomes negotiable. Your time, your energy, your attention, your availability, your focus, your peace. Little by little, the world begins making decisions about your life that you never consciously made yourself. Not because people are malicious, because you never communicated where the limits were. And when limits remain invisible, expectations grow. That's what expectations do. They expand until they meet resistance. So you answer every call, return every message, accept every responsibility, carry every emotional burden, solve every problem, become available for every crisis, become dependable for every emergency, become the person everyone turns to. Because you've taught them that you'll always say yes. At first that feels meaningful, needed, important. You feel useful, valued, reliable, and those things matter. Human beings want to matter. We want to contribute. We want to help. But without boundaries, helpfulness slowly turns into obligation, and obligation slowly turns into pressure, and pressure slowly turns into exhaustion. Not all at once, gradually, quietly. So quietly that many people don't notice what's happening until years later. Because the real cost isn't always obvious. The real cost isn't the busy schedule, the overflowing calendar, the constant demands, the sleepless nights. Those are symptoms. The deeper cost is something else. Somewhere along the way, you disappear. Your needs become secondary. Your recovery becomes optional. Your rest becomes negotiable. Your priorities become flexible. Your inner life becomes an afterthought. And eventually you wake up one day feeling strangely disconnected from yourself. Not because life is terrible, because you've spent so long responding to everyone else's needs that you've stopped listening to your own. That's the hidden cost. Not exhaustion, not frustration, not burnout, self-abandonment. The slow process of becoming unavailable to yourself while remaining available to everyone else. And the tragedy is, many good people mistake this for love. They think, this is what caring looks like. This is what being a good person looks like. This is what generosity looks like. But generosity without boundaries eventually becomes depletion, because even the most giving person still has limits. Even the most compassionate person still requires rest. Even the most loving person still needs room to exist. Awareness eventually notices this. It notices that the exhaustion isn't coming from caring. It's coming from caring without structure, giving without limits, helping without recovery, serving without stewardship. And that's when something important changes. You begin realizing that boundaries are not barriers to love. They're what allow love to remain sustainable. Because a life with no boundaries doesn't create deeper connection. It creates crowding. And when everything has access to you, eventually you lose access to yourself. That's why boundaries matter. Not because they keep people out, because they make sure you remain present inside your own life. Because the goal was never to become unavailable to others. The goal was to stop becoming unavailable to yourself. The feeling of discovering that strength and control are not the same thing. This is where many people get confused, because boundaries and control can look similar from a distance. Both change behavior, both create limits, both alter what happens next. But underneath, they come from completely different places. Control says, you must behave differently. You need to stop. You need to change. You need to become what I need you to be. The focus is outward. The energy moves toward managing someone else, trying to shape their choices, trying to direct their behavior, trying to create a different outcome through pressure. Boundaries sound different. Boundaries say, I will behave differently. I will not participate in this. I will leave if this continues. I'm not available for that. I cannot carry this. Notice the difference. The boundary isn't attempting to control another person. It's communicating a choice, a limit, a responsibility, a decision about participation. Control focuses outward. Boundaries focus inward. One tries to manage others. The other manages self. That's a huge distinction. Because awareness eventually learns one of the most important truths in all relationships. You cannot control another person's choices. Not permanently, not honestly, not sustainably. You can influence, you can encourage, you can communicate, you can request, you can hope, but you cannot ultimately decide for another human being. And the sooner awareness accepts that, the more peaceful life becomes. Because a tremendous amount of suffering comes from trying to control what was never ours to control. Another person's emotions, another person's reactions, another person's growth, another person's healing, another person's decisions. We exhaust ourselves, trying to manage realities that do not belong to us. Boundaries interrupt that cycle. They quietly say, I respect your right to choose, and I respect my right to choose too. That's why healthy boundaries often feel calmer than control. They don't require force. They don't require domination. They don't require winning. Because the boundary isn't demanding compliance. It's communicating participation. If this happens, this is what I will do. If that continues, this is how I will respond. If this environment remains the same, I will choose differently. There's a quiet strength in that, because it removes the struggle of trying to control another person and returns responsibility to the only place it truly belongs, yourself. That's where healthy boundaries live, not in forcing, in choosing, not in managing others, in managing participation, not in changing people, in deciding what aligns with your values, your energy, your peace, and your capacity. And perhaps that's why boundaries become less angry as awareness matures, because eventually you stop trying to make people different. You simply become clearer about how you will engage. And that's a different kind of power, a quieter one, a healthier one. The power of knowing that your peace does not depend on controlling another person, only on being honest about what you are willing and unwilling to participate in. This is where things become difficult, Not when you understand boundaries, not when you agree with them intellectually, when you begin living them, especially for caring people, especially for helpers, especially for those who spent years being the stabilizer, the peacemaker, the responsible one, the dependable one, the person who always stepped in, always adjusted, always absorbed a little more, always found a way to make things work. Because if you've spent years building your identity around being needed, protecting yourself can feel strangely uncomfortable. Even when it's healthy, even when it's necessary, even when it's long overdue. Because when you finally begin protecting your energy, guilt often arrives first. Not peace, not relief, guilt. You start questioning yourself. Am I selfish? Am I being difficult? Am I overreacting? Should I just do it anyway? Maybe it's not that big of a deal. And suddenly the boundary you felt certain about yesterday starts feeling negotiable again. Not because it was wrong, because your nervous system is adjusting to a new pattern. For years, it may have equated self-sacrifice with love, availability with worth, overfunctioning with goodness. So when you stop doing those things, part of you feels like you're doing something wrong, even when you're finally doing something healthy. That's important to understand, because sometimes you'll feel guilty simply because you're no longer overfunctioning, not because you're harming anyone, not because you're abandoning anyone, not because you're becoming selfish, simply because you're no longer carrying what was never yours to carry. And awareness eventually notices something surprising. Many people never objected to your exhaustion. They object to your change because your exhaustion was convenient. Your overextension was predictable. Your lack of boundaries made certain dynamics easy. So when you finally begin saying, I can't do that, I don't have capacity for that, I need space, I need rest, the relationship changes. And change creates discomfort, not necessarily because the other person is bad, because they're adjusting too, but sometimes you'll discover something difficult. Some people only experience your boundary as rejection because they benefited from your lack of one. That realization can sting because it forces you to ask, did they value me? Or did they value my availability? Did they appreciate me? Or did they appreciate my willingness to carry things for them? And sometimes the answer is uncomfortable. But awareness would rather face an uncomfortable truth than continue living inside a comfortable illusion. Because a healthy boundary doesn't become unhealthy simply because someone dislikes it. A necessary boundary doesn't become selfish simply because someone feels disappointed. And disappointment is not the same thing as harm. That's an important distinction. People are allowed to be disappointed. They're allowed to wish things were different. They're allowed to miss the version of you that always said yes. But you are also allowed to stop abandoning yourself to keep everyone else comfortable. That's maturity, not becoming harder, becoming more honest. And over time, something beautiful begins happening. The guilt starts fading. Not because you stop caring, because you finally understand that caring for others and caring for yourself were never supposed to be enemies. The healthiest boundaries are not acts of rejection. They're acts of stewardship. A way of saying, I value this life enough to stop giving away pieces of it that I cannot afford to lose. And that's not selfish. That's responsibility. That's sustainability. That's love with structure. And for many people, that's a lesson that takes years to learn. Many people learn this lesson early, long before they had language for it, long before they understood what was happening, long before they knew those childhood adaptations would follow them into adulthood. The lessons sounded something like this: be helpful, be agreeable, be available, be easy, don't be too much, don't create problems, don't make things harder. And if you were those things, connection felt safer, approval felt safer, belonging felt safer, love felt safer. Not because anyone sat you down and explained it directly, because your nervous system learned it. Through repetition, through experience, through observing what created acceptance and what created distance. So you adapted. Children are remarkably good at adapting. They have to be. You became accommodating, attentive, responsible, reliable. The one who noticed what others needed. The one who solved problems. The one who adjusted. The one who made life easier for everyone else. And those adaptations often worked. That's the difficult part. They worked. They created safety, they reduced conflict, they increased connection, they helped you survive the environment you were in. But survival strategies don't always retire when the danger disappears. Sometimes they remain long after they're needed, long after the environment changed, long after the child became an adult. And eventually, something subtle happens. You stop asking what you need, not intentionally. It simply stops being the question. Because everyone else's needs occupy all available space, you become so practiced at scanning outward that you lose contact with what is happening inward. You know when everyone else is upset. You know when everyone else is struggling. You know when everyone else needs support. But when someone asks, "What do you need?" you hesitate because you spent years becoming fluent in everyone else's experience while slowly forgetting your own. Years later, those childhood patterns are still there, only now they have adult names: overcommitment, people-pleasing, difficulty saying no, fear of disappointing others, over-responsibility, emotional caretaking, constant availability. And from the outside, those traits often look admirable. People compliment them, reward them, depend on them. But internally, they can become exhausting because every adaptation comes with a cost. And eventually the cost arrives. Not dramatically, quietly. You begin feeling tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. You begin feeling responsible for things you never consciously chose. You begin feeling guilty for wanting space, guilty for resting, guilty for having limits, guilty for saying no. And that's often the moment awareness begins connecting the dots. The child survived. The adaptation worked. The strategy succeeded. But the adult is exhausted, not because they are weak, because they're still using a survival strategy for an environment that no longer exists. And that's an important realization, because awareness doesn't shame the child. The child did exactly what was necessary. The child learned how to stay connected, how to stay safe, how to stay loved. The goal now isn't to criticize those adaptations, it's to update them, to recognize that adulthood offers something the child never had: choice, the ability to ask, does this still serve me? Is this helping me live? Is this love? Or is this fear disguised as responsibility? Those questions matter, because eventually the healthiest thing you can do is give yourself permission to stop earning what should never have required earning in the first place: love, belonging, connection, worth. And perhaps one of the most healing realizations a person can have is this: you no longer have to exhaust yourself to deserve a place in someone's life. You are allowed to be loved without constantly proving your usefulness. You are allowed to matter without carrying everything. And you are allowed to exist without earning your right to take up space. Here's something strange. The healthier you become, the more some relationships change. Not because you're becoming cruel, not because you're becoming distant, not because you're becoming selfish, because you're becoming clear. And clarity has a way of revealing things that confusion used to hide. For years, people may have known the version of you that always adjusted, always accommodated, always found a way, always made room, always absorbed the extra weight. And because that version of you felt familiar, the relationship organized itself around it. Then something changes. You begin listening to yourself. You begin honoring your limits. You begin noticing your capacity. You begin saying no when no is true. And suddenly, the relationship has to adapt. That's where things become revealing. Some people celebrate your boundaries. They respect them. They adjust. They listen. They recognize that your well-being matters too. They may not always like the limit, but they respect your right to have one. Those relationships often become healthier, more honest, more balanced, more sustainable. But other people respond differently. The moment the boundary appears, so does resistance, pushback, guilt, frustration, disappointment, negotiation, pressure. And that can be confusing at first, because you think, I finally communicated honestly. I finally expressed what I need. I finally stopped abandoning myself. Why is this creating tension? The answer isn't always pleasant. Sometimes the old arrangement worked better for them, not because they're evil, not because they consciously planned it, because they benefited from access that no longer exists. The version of you without boundaries was easier to depend on, easier to lean on, easier to access, easier to ask things from. And now that the arrangement has changed, they feel the difference. Awareness notices this, and honestly, it can be painful, because sometimes you discover that people were attached to your availability more than your well-being, attached to your accommodation more than your authenticity, attached to what you provided more than what you needed. That's a difficult realization, not because it means they never cared, but because it reveals something about the structure of the relationship, and often, that revelation arrives the moment a boundary appears. That's why boundaries can be so clarifying, not because they change people. They reveal people. They reveal who can adapt, who can respect limits, who can tolerate disappointment, who can remain connected without unlimited access. And sometimes, the resistance teaches you more about the relationship than years of interaction ever did, because when everything is easy, many dynamics remain invisible. When you always say yes, nobody learns how they respond to no. When you always carry the burden, nobody learns what happens when you put it down. When you always accommodate, nobody learns how much respect exists for your limits. But boundaries reveal those things quickly, not because boundaries create the truth, because boundaries expose it. And while that can hurt, it can also be freeing. Because clarity, even painful clarity, is often healthier than comfort built on illusion. The goal was never to make everyone happy. The goal was never to become endlessly available. The goal was never to maintain every relationship at the cost of yourself. The goal was honesty, and honest relationships can survive clarity. In fact, they usually become stronger because of it. A healthy boundary is not an attack. It isn't punishment. It isn't retaliation. It isn't emotional revenge. It isn't a way of making someone feel guilty. It isn't a weapon. And that's important to understand, because many people first encounter boundaries in unhealthy situations, after resentment has built, after frustration has accumulated, after someone has reached their limit. So the boundary arrives carrying emotion, carrying exhaustion, carrying years of unspoken strain. And because of that, people mistake the boundary for the frustration surrounding it. But they're not the same thing. The frustration came from the absence of the boundary, not the presence of it. At its healthiest, a boundary is something much simpler. It's communication, information, clarity. It says, this works for me, this doesn't. I can do this, I cannot do that. I'm available for this. I'm not available for that. This is sustainable. This isn't. Simple, clear, respectful, not dramatic, not aggressive, not controlling, just honest. And honesty is often much less complicated than people imagine. The problem is, many people only encounter boundaries after conflict, after the relationship is already strained, after misunderstandings have piled up, after expectations have become invisible agreements. So they assume boundaries create conflict, but healthy boundaries actually reduce it, because conflict often grows in the absence of clarity. When expectations remain unspoken, people guess. When limits remain invisible, people assume. When needs remain hidden, resentment quietly develops underground. That's where many conflicts begin, not with disagreement, with uncertainty. One person assumes one thing, another person assumes something else. Nobody communicates, and eventually, both people feel frustrated. A boundary interrupts that process. It brings the invisible into the light. It makes expectations visible, and visibility creates clarity. Now people know. Now assumptions become unnecessary. Now both people can make informed choices. That's why mature boundaries often feel surprisingly calm. They're not trying to hurt anyone. They're trying to eliminate confusion. They're creating a shared understanding of reality. And reality, even when uncomfortable, is easier to work with than assumptions. Awareness eventually learns this. The goal of a boundary isn't distance. The goal isn't control. The goal isn't punishment. The goal is clarity, because clarity allows people to interact honestly, to relate honestly, to choose honestly. And relationships built on honesty are usually much healthier than relationships built on unspoken expectations. That's why boundaries, when offered with respect, are often acts of care. not just for you, for everyone involved. Because the more visible reality becomes, the less energy people spend trying to guess what was never communicated. And where there is clarity, there is far less room for resentment to grow in the dark. Distance can be healthy. Punishment is something else. From the outside, they can sometimes look similar. A person becomes less available. A conversation pauses. A relationship creates space. Contact decreases. And people often assume the same thing is happening. But awareness eventually learns there is a profound difference between distance and punishment. Healthy distance says, I need space. I need time. I need room to think. I need room to recover. I need room to hear myself again. Punishment says, I need you to suffer. I need you to feel what I felt. I need you to hurt. I need you to pay. One is about restoration. The other is about control. One creates healing. The other creates leverage. One creates clarity. The other creates fear. That's why intention matters, because the action may appear similar, but the purpose underneath it is completely different. A healthy boundary doesn't withdraw to create pain. It withdraws to create honesty, to create perspective, to create enough space for reality to become visible again. And honestly, many caring people struggle with this because they've been taught that stepping back automatically means abandonment, that taking space means rejection, that needing recovery means they're failing someone. But those things are not the same. Not every step backward is rejection. Not every pause is punishment. Not every no is hostility. Sometimes it's recovery. Sometimes it's recalibration. Sometimes it's the nervous system finally acknowledging what it can and cannot sustain. You've probably experienced this before. A conversation becomes too heated. A situation becomes too consuming. A relationship becomes too emotionally crowded. And every instinct says, keep pushing, fix it now, resolve it immediately. But awareness notices something else. Sometimes more interaction doesn't create clarity. It creates more confusion. Sometimes more talking doesn't create understanding. It creates more defensiveness. Sometimes the healthiest thing possible is a little space. Not to escape, not to punish, to reset, to breathe, to remember what is true beneath all the emotional noise. Because when people are overwhelmed, they often stop hearing each other. And distance, used wisely, creates the room necessary for perspective to return. That's why mature boundaries don't sound like threats. They sound like honesty. I need a little space. I need time to think. I need to step back. Not because I'm abandoning you, because I want to return honestly. That's an important distinction, because punishment wants separation to create suffering. Healthy distance wants separation to create healing. Punishment says, feel what I felt. Healthy distance says, I need to stop bleeding before we continue. And one of the clearest signs of emotional maturity is learning that difference. Learning that space is not always rejection. Silence is not always hostility. Distance is not always the end. Sometimes it's simply the space required for truth, clarity, and connection to become possible again. Because awareness eventually discovers that not every relationship is strengthened by more contact. Some are strengthened by enough space for honesty to return. And sometimes, the most loving thing you can say is, I need some distance right now so I can come back as my honest self. Something interesting happens when a healthy boundary is finally established. Not when you think about it, not when you rehearse it, not when you tell yourself you should do it, when you actually do it, when the truth is finally spoken, when the limit is finally acknowledged, when reality finally becomes visible. Relief arrives, not immediately, not dramatically, quietly, almost so quietly that you miss it at first. There's no fireworks, no grand moment of victory, no sudden transformation, just a subtle shift, a little more room inside your chest, a little less tension in your shoulders, a little less noise in your mind, because your nervous system begins noticing what it no longer has to carry, the constant anticipation, the constant vigilance, the constant emotional monitoring, the constant calculation, the constant preparation for the next request, the next demand, the next expectation, the next emergency. that somehow becomes yours. For a long time, you may not have realized how much energy that required, because when a burden becomes familiar, it stops feeling like a burden. It starts feeling like life, like normal, like who you are, until one day the weight is removed and you suddenly notice how heavy it was. You stop waiting for the next obligation. You stop checking your phone with the same anxiety. You stop scanning every interaction for what might be needed from you. You stop preparing yourself to give away energy you don't actually have. And for the first time in a very long time, your body begins breathing differently. Not because life became easier, not because every problem disappeared, not because everyone suddenly understood, because life became more honest, and honesty creates relief, even when it's uncomfortable, especially when it's uncomfortable. Because dishonesty is expensive. Pretending you're okay when you're overwhelmed, pretending you have capacity when you're exhausted, pretending you can continue carrying something that is already crushing you. That costs energy, a tremendous amount of energy. And many people don't realize how much of their stress comes from maintaining realities that aren't true. That's why boundaries feel so powerful, not because they create peace, because they remove distortion. They bring reality back into the room. And reality, while sometimes uncomfortable, is far less exhausting than pretending. Many people think boundaries create stress. They imagine conflict, discomfort, tension, difficult conversations, and sometimes those things happen. But often, boundaries don't create stress. They reveal it. The stress was already there. The resentment was already there. The exhaustion was already there. The boundary simply made it visible. And visibility changes everything. Because you cannot heal what you refuse to acknowledge. You cannot recover from a burden you pretend doesn't exist. You cannot create balance while denying the weight you're carrying. Awareness eventually understands this. The purpose of a boundary isn't to make life smaller. It's to make life honest. And once honesty arrives, healing finally has somewhere to begin. Because for the first time, your nervous system is no longer spending energy protecting an unsustainable reality. For the first time, it can focus on recovery, on restoration, on breathing, on becoming. And sometimes, that quiet exhale after a long overdue boundary isn't relief because something ended. It's relief because you finally stopped abandoning yourself, and your body, perhaps for the first time in years, noticed. Interestingly, healthy boundaries don't usually feel powerful, at least not the way people imagine. They don't feel like victory. They don't feel like domination. They don't feel like finally winning. In fact, most healthy boundaries feel surprisingly ordinary. They feel peaceful. And for many people, peace feels unfamiliar at first, because they've spent so much of their lives managing tension, managing expectations, managing other people's emotions, managing obligations they never consciously agreed to carry. So when the burden finally lifts, the absence of pressure can feel strange, almost suspicious. But over time, you begin noticing the difference. Less chaos, less resentment, less emotional debt, less mental clutter, less internal negotiation. You stop replaying conversations at 2 o'clock in the morning. You stop wondering whether you disappointed everyone. You stop rehearsing explanations for choices you're allowed to make. You stop carrying obligations you never actually agreed to. That's a bigger shift than most people realize, because many people spend years living under invisible contracts, unspoken expectations, assumed responsibilities, emotional debts they never knowingly accepted. And awareness eventually asks, who decided this was mine? That's an important question, because a surprising amount of stress comes from carrying responsibilities that were assigned through assumption rather than agreement. Healthy boundaries bring those assumptions into the light. And once they become visible, something changes. You stop feeling trapped. You stop feeling cornered. You stop feeling responsible for outcomes that were never fully yours to manage. And slowly, your nervous system starts breathing again, not in some dramatic, life-changing moment, quietly, gradually. The way a clenched hand eventually opens, the way a muscle finally releases tension, the way a person stops bracing for impact after realizing the impact isn't coming. That's often what healthy boundaries feel like. Not power, relief. Because for the first time, your internal reality and your external reality begin matching. You're no longer saying yes when you mean no. You're no longer offering energy you don't have. You're no longer pretending to have capacity when you're already depleted. You're no longer negotiating against yourself. And that honesty creates space. Space to think. Space to rest. Space to choose. Space to recover. Space to hear your own thoughts again. That's why boundaries are rarely about keeping people out. They're about making room. Room for truth. Room for health. Room for relationships that can survive honesty. Room for a life that is actually sustainable. Not because life became perfect. Life never becomes perfect. People still disappoint you. Challenges still arrive. Responsibilities still exist. But something important changes. Your life becomes honest. And honesty creates room. Room to breathe. Room to heal. Room to exist without constantly abandoning yourself. And for many people, that quiet sense of room is the first real peace they've felt in a very long time. Let me ask you something gently. Where in your life have you been saying yes, when your awareness has been quietly asking for no? Who have you been protecting at the expense of yourself? And deeper than that, what signal have you been ignoring, simply because you didn't want to disappoint someone? Because sometimes the discomfort you're avoiding today becomes the resentment you carry tomorrow. If you've been feeling overwhelmed lately, if you've been carrying too much responsibility, too much emotional labor, too many expectations, too many obligations, too many things that somehow became yours, without you ever consciously choosing them, there may be nothing wrong with you. Take a moment and really consider that possibility. There may be nothing wrong with you. You may not be failing. You may not be weak. You may not be becoming less capable. You may simply be carrying more than one person was ever meant to carry. And awareness notices that eventually. It notices the exhaustion, the resentment, the heaviness, the quiet feeling that life has become crowded. Not because you're a bad person, because you've spent too long trying to be everything for everyone. Maybe what you need isn't more discipline. Maybe it isn't more effort. Maybe it isn't another strategy for enduring what is already draining you. Maybe you need boundaries, not anger, not bitterness, not emotional walls, not shutting people out, not becoming cold. Boundaries, simple, honest, healthy boundaries, the ability to recognize where your responsibility ends, the ability to recognize what actually belongs to you, the ability to hear your own needs before exhaustion has to scream them. Because boundaries aren't about loving people less. They're about abandoning yourself less. That's the distinction. Many people spend years believing they must choose between kindness and self-respect, between compassion and protection, between caring for others and caring for themselves. But awareness eventually discovers those were never opposing forces. Healthy boundaries allow both. The ability to protect peace without abandoning kindness. The ability to honor yourself without condemning others. The ability to say no without making someone the enemy. The ability to step back without needing someone to suffer. The ability to stay open without remaining unprotected. And perhaps that's what maturity really begins to look like. Not becoming harder, becoming clearer, not becoming less loving, becoming more honest, not withdrawing from life, participating in it sustainably. Because a life without boundaries eventually creates exhaustion. But a life with healthy boundaries creates something different. Space, room, breathing room, space for recovery, space for authenticity, space for relationships that can survive honesty, space for a nervous system that no longer has to remain on guard every moment of every day. And when that space appears, something remarkable happens. You begin returning to yourself. The version of you that existed underneath the obligations, underneath the overfunctioning, underneath the guilt, underneath the endless need to prove your worth through usefulness. You begin remembering that your value was never supposed to come from how much you could carry. And maybe that's the deeper lesson. You were never meant to sacrifice yourself for acceptance. You were never meant to disappear inside service. You were never meant to earn belonging through exhaustion. You were meant to participate in life honestly, to care deeply, to love generously, to remain open, and still protect what matters. That isn't selfishness. That isn't rejection. That isn't weakness. That's stewardship. That's responsibility. That's wisdom. That's movement. That's what happens when awareness stops sacrificing itself for acceptance and finally begins protecting the life it was entrusted to live. That's the movement. That's the shift. That's the Reasonaut journey. Take a breath. If this episode brought you clarity, comfort, or simply helped put words to something you've been carrying, thank you for spending this time with us, dedicated to those who are learning that protecting your peace does not require abandoning your kindness, and that boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of stewardship. If you're enjoying the journey, share this episode with someone who may need it. Subscribe wherever you're listening. Follow the podcast so you don't miss future conversations. And if you'd like to continue the discussion, join us on Facebook. Not for noise, not for arguments, just a place where fellow Reasonauts can continue growing together. Next time, we explore something equally misunderstood: how to stay soft without becoming weak. Until next time, every day is awesome. We just have to get through it. I'll see you in episode 23.